Hey, everybody, welcome back. I'm Jason Isaac, founder and CEO of the American Energy Institute, joined with our economist, host, and the CEO of PetroNerds, the PetroNerds podcast, Trisha Curtis. Last time when we were talking, we had a great post on X, and Trisha and I thought this just makes for an entire show. So let me read you this post that we had on X last time that Trisha and I were together. It was from @AshmoreHardy. Can you talk more about the linkage between energy security and national security, and what happens if we crater our domestic energy industry in the name of climate change, especially as it goes to China's growing military power? So none better than to have Trisha, an expert on China and all things energy, come on and talk about this. So Trisha, go ahead. This is just a fantastic question. I know you and I were kind of jonesing after seeing this after our last live stream. Like, hey, we've got to talk about this as an entire show. So here we go. Let's go. Thoughts on that particular post from AshmoreHardy?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. And I was like, man, we got it at the end. And I wanted to spend a whole show on this because you could, half of my business is just national security and energy security in China. So it's the way it relates is extremely relevant. So you do not have national security if you don't have energy security. So that's one. But particularly as we're thinking about a global competition, we're really head to head. We are head to head with China in this global competition, in this race. So when we think about that, that means that, as Chris Wright and everybody says, energy is everything. That means that that's what we're talking about, right? Is that we are in a global competition to make things, to produce things, to outcompete on every level with China. And so that takes energy to make it. And so the biggest things I think about when we're talking about our global race for competition is one, how you consume energy. Do you have the energy? How you actually produce things, how you manufacture things, your cost of doing so, and your access to energy. And then realizing that the US and the West, particularly Europe, are the only countries in the world that are actually, we're actually concerned about emissions more than we are for the actual energy. We're not as concerned about affordability or reliability as we are emissions. Now, obviously that is shifting and that is changing with the new administration. But in the previous administration, we basically chose CO2 emissions and climate over national security and energy security. So those are huge, that's kind of the biggest setting point. And so if you are somebody like me that is watching this and looking at this data and thinking, okay, if you are in we're on a competition and an AI race and an everything race with China as we speak. But if you were in a kinetic conflict, and God forbid, we're actually in a warfare, things where ammunition is flying with China, you have to really realize that, or with any nation for that matter, you have to realize that energy is the heart of the ability to produce things. And so when you look at the war in Ukraine and you see what Russia has done to Ukraine, and historically speaking, when we look at wars, they target energy infrastructure because they want to target their ability to produce things. Ukraine has gotten very, very good at producing drones. And so several months ago, Russia was doubling down on their effort to hit their power infrastructure so they couldn't make these drones that they were hitting Russia with or looking to defend themselves with. So you think about that for the US, and China, is that China is the world's largest consumer of electricity, right? They're over 10,000 terawatt hours now of electricity consumption. We are just north of 4,500. We've actually ticked up a smidgen in the latest 2024 data, but you just think about that. We're half of China's electricity consumption. That should give everyone pause and everyone massive concern. We should be spending study after study after study just looking at that, because that's the stuff that drives AI, that's the stuff that drives biotech, that's everything. And so folks, they don't pay for this, right? They basically just massively subsidize this, and this is all largely coming from coal-fired power generation. And I thought that question was so relevant because I get really inflamed when I'm looking at, actual Chinese data and US data, and everybody's talking about climate and what we're doing, what we're not doing. And when I see the latest data for China and coal consumption, it is 92 exajoules out of 165 globally. The chart looks like this, folks. It is one direction. It's like this. It just goes up every year. And you can't they increased electricity consumption by over 500 terawatt hours. So they were 9,500 last year. 2023, they're over 10,000 now. That's massive. That's more than half of Japan's entire grid that China added last year alone. So, that's just huge. And so when people are saying the AI race, it's going to be 1,000 terawatt hours, which is China's grid, or which is Japan's grid. China added almost half of Japan's grid last year. So we really need to put in this perspective of that, we have got to set aside the climate and CO2 emissions conflict, because that is not the number one conflict. And that we're not going to win, because if China's adding, over half of Japan's grid, largely in coal-fired power generation, we're not going to change this. And so when their coal consumption is just up and to the right, we are now all-time highs for global coal consumption. We were last year, we continue to break that, and it's largely on the back of China, because they're consuming 92 out of that 165 total. I mean, that's more than half. It's just astronomical. And so I want to bring people back to, when you think about energy and you think about national security, your ability to make things, your ability to actually make an airplane, make an automobile, make, a tank, make bullets. Those are all, you have to have power generation to do that. And so when you think about, everybody's looking at China as though it's this, they're just making t-shirts and batteries and solar panels and wind turbines, and it's like, well, okay, they're decimating you on all those things, and that's true, and they're dumping them into your economy, and that's hurting you, but it's more important than that. Like, they're making a lot of other things. Particularly, they are making a lot of the stuff that Russia's using in this war. They are helping them with those tanks and those automotives and everything, and you need power to do that. So it does all start with power generation, and you do need to be thinking geopolitically, and you do need to be thinking about national security. And I'll stop there, because there's a lot of layers we can go into with that. But as you can tell, I'm really fired up about the linkage between energy security and national security.
Yeah, and I think what we've seen is that we've seen some realizations from this administration about the American energy dominance agenda. And Lee Zeldin at the EPA came out last month with new greenhouse gas emission rules and mercury air toxin standard rules for existing and new power plants, basically saying they're going to eliminate those because the greenhouse gas emissions don't pose a threat to the environment or human health. It's interesting. They said this during a conference that I was part of weeks ago, where they were advising and briefing people on some of their rule requirements and rule proposals. The media just reporting it this week. I mean, it took the Washington Post nearly 6 months to come out and say the EPA says that greenhouse gas emissions don't pose a risk to human health. And it's like, thank you.
They don't. That's because they don't want to say that. They don't want to say that. Yeah.
But that's actually the truth. And then you've seen also this week with the endangerment finding, getting rid of the endangerment finding, which says that greenhouse gas emissions pose a threat to human health and must be regulated under the Clean Air Act. That was something that happened during the 2009 Obama administration by the deep state. There was no law in Congress that changed the Clean Air Act. This was one of these rules that was promulgated. And so it's great to see that, because what we've seen just in the last few months is over 40 power plants. I saw this from a presentation from Mike Nassy with Jackson Walker, longtime environmental an attorney that I've worked closely with for years now, talking about there are over 40 coal-fired power plants in the United States that have paused their retirement or early retirement plans. I think this is a good thing for coal markets. And you talked a little bit about some power generation and demand in China. What does the net generation of coal look like compared to renewables here in the United States? And do we see any hope for an increase for reliable, affordable electric generation?
Well, so I have hope for it, and I have hope for all those comments you made. I mean, I think it's wonderful that the Trump administration has executive orders in place to actually mine for coal. We effectively have a moratorium on mining coal in the U.S. So, and this way, this is so relevant with China, is that they have no moratorium on mining, right? They have no moratorium on consumption or building out power plants, and they have all this coal, and then they subsidize their industry with it. And we need to be thinking in the same vein. And that's really problematic when you're looking at the chart for U.S. electricity generation, and you're seeing where it's coming from, is we now have wind and solar power combined has now eclipsed coal. And so coal, as we've talked about a lot, and Jason, is that's that reliable, dispatchable baseload power generation that we have in the U.S. Yes, we have nuclear as well, and we have natural gas, and that natural gas piece is rising, and that's fantastic. But you can't reduce coal because it's extremely cheap and it's extremely reliable. And so if you're displacing coal with wind and solar and not with natural gas or nuclear, that's a problem. And that's what we've done. And so you can see the chart that I showed you is that's coal-fired power generation declining and wind and solar power generation increasing, eclipsing coal. And look at the price of electricity prices. They're up and to the right. And so you have this untenable situation. And so I love that these executive orders, I love that you have companies that are looking looking at this. I think this takes a little time. This isn't dissimilar to what I've been talking to the oil and gas industry about for yeah, you guys can all rah all you want on CO2 emissions and net zero, but you will roll that back eventually because it's not going to win the day. And investor pressure only lasts so long and it changes. And I've told everyone, when you have a change of administration and they are not in the Paris Climate Accords and they don't care about CO2 emissions, you as an industry are going to realize that how you make money is putting the drill bit into the ground and drilling and producing oil. That's what I would like you to focus on as a shareholder and as American, and I want you to drill and produce oil and make us the most energy secure, energy dominant nation in the world, and focus on that. CO2 emissions from the oil and gas industry production is 1% of our CO2 emissions. It means nothing. And so the fact that we've allowed companies to even focus on this is ridiculous. But when this comes back to power generation, it means that we're fighting a battle we're not going to win, one, on CO2. Because when I said that, China is 92 exajoules of 165 globally, they're not stopping that. They're not hell-bent, they're not bound by any institutional norms. Like, they don't care about human rights standards. They have millions of Uyghurs working for $0 on forced labor so they can keep their costs down. If they don't comply with basic human rights standards, do we really think they're going to comply with CO2 emissions? Absolutely not. And in fact, we have to really appreciate that reliable baseload coal that we're talking about, how meaningful that is to an economy, especially an economy that's in competition. That is what they have, that's their energy security. And so they're banking everything on it. And so we're really just not appreciating that China is a modern coal power, right? And that's how it's leading, that's how it's manufacturing, that's how it's making things. And so when we think about our grid and we think about adding wind and solar, it is to the detriment, not just of our consumers and our affordability and reliability, it's to the detriment of our businesses and our national security and everything, because we're seeing that those prices up and to the right. And so I'm inflamed that we're the largest oil and natural gas producer in the entire world, and we have more coal than China. We have more coal than any nation in the world. We have zero excuses to have high electricity prices. And so when we see those electricity prices continuing to escalate, the Trump administration is going to have to get on this. They're going to have to start saying, okay, no, we have to stop now the retirement of coal-fired power plants, and we have to start rolling back this wind and solar in order to get these electricity prices down. Like, they have to do that. And that directly enhances your national energy security because it enhances your reliability of your grid. And so the intermittency of wind and solar is just that's adding the non-dispatchable, non-baseload power generation. It's adding the intermittency, and it's reducing our reliability. So it has a direct impact on just the consumer's well-being, a business's well-being, their ability to compete head-to-head with any competition globally, but also China, and just our ability to turn our lights on. And so those have, from a consumer level to a national security level, that's huge. And it's very, very basic, and it's very real. And so I'm disheartened when I look at the data. I'm hopeful that the Trump administration, we're going to see that stop, at least but it hasn't stopped yet.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you talk about wind and solar, everybody says that they're cheaper and the costs are coming down, but our electricity costs are going up. They're not cheaper. Their net generation may be more, but where they're not more is during that peak demand time. When you
Totally.
really need them the most, that's when you've got to ramp up the coal, the natural gas, and those costs skyrocket during those times because we've become too dependent on these variable sources of electric generation that are heavily dependent not only on subsidies, but on China. So we've literally been subsidizing the Chinese Communist Party by propping up these unreliable sources of generation, which is just mind-boggling to me. It seems
better yet, Jason, you're subsidizing and propping up CO2 emissions. So if you care about climate at all, then you are just gifting it you're basically just saying, if you're buying wind and solar panels from China, which that's what you're doing, you are increasing global CO2 emissions directly, right? You have to stop buying stuff from China if you want to reduce global CO2 emissions. So you could say that Trump has done more for the climate movement than any president in U.S. history, because he's actually willing to stand and say, hey, let's stop buying cheap shit from China. Sorry, excuse my language, but that's the problem that we have, is we're buying all this cheap crap from China and they're making it with us up. But it's so much more important than the cheap stuff. And the wind and solar thing, I think this is just an added benefit for them. It directly destabilizes every grid that you put it into it. There's no grid that you put wind and solar into that doesn't increase electricity costs. So China knows that, part of their game right now, when they have this very cheap EVs, right? It's a race to the bottom. They're extremely cheap. Well, they're decimating global auto manufacturing, right? Because if you can sell an EV for $7,000, which they're doing in China, you can't compete for an ICE vehicle. You can't compete in anything. Why do you think they did it in EVs? It's because they couldn't compete in internal combustion engine in ICE vehicles. So they just went to EVs. It's not leapfrogging, folks. They have a strategy with this, right? They're using coal-fired power generation. That's how they plug in their EVs, and it makes them less open and less hurt and vulnerable to oil imports, and they consume a lot of oil. So that's something we can talk about later. But I mean, there's a mechanism to this. That's like, if you want to know about any, like, if you're looking for any continuity or any thread or anything, look at Chinese energy consumption. That is your continuity. That is your thread. That is what you can take to the bank. And so we have to be looking at our energy consumption as well, and the fact that if any nation is looking at us and they're seeing this, and that's why I think this is so important, is that everyone's talking about NATO spending and the increase in NATO spending in Europe. And I think I mentioned it on our last recording. This is driving me nuts that Europe has not increased their electricity. In fact, they declined power generation last year as well in total Europe. How the hell can you increase your NATO spending and make ammunition and make bullets and make stuff and spend more if you don't have the power generation to actually produce it? They can't. It means that they will be buying all of it from the US, which is a win for us, great, but it means that they can't do that. They'll be spending so much money on defense, way more than they expect. So you have to get your house in order of just the ability to make things in order to increase your spending on military. So they relinquished their energy security to Russia years ago, and as they were doing it, they relinquished all their national defense as well. And now they're realizing they have to have national defense. Well, none of this, you don't have anything without energy. So it's going to come back to energy no matter what. And so I think it's really, really important is that look at electricity, to look at where the electricity is coming from, and to look at traditional fuel consumption. And the countries that are using traditional fuels and electricity are winning the day.
Yeah, I think it just announced this week, Poland is looking to explore oil and gas in their country. They're rejecting this climate alarmist movement in the EU, which is going to be great for Poland. They're also doing some great things on immigration. So Poland could be the shining star in the EU here before long, which I think is a great thing. Also this week, Lisa Murkowski got pretty furious because the Trump administration is going after these variable sources of electric generation and directing the Secretary of the Treasury and the DOE to uphold the law and really require that these components come from the United States. She had fought tirelessly to keep the subsidies for wind and solar and the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that did stay in the bill. But the president made, I think, some promises to the Freedom Caucus, is my understanding, that, hey, if you guys go along with this, I'm going to do some executive action to enforce laws that are on the books that are really going to hurt those industries that are dependent on corporate welfare through taxpayers. So good news there. That's going to lead to more affordable and reliable energy. I think that's
that I think gets to the really, if and that's where I think where people are always a little bit confused about the Trump administration of, oh, what are they doing on tariffs? Trump has made some recent comments that the way he's going to compete with China is in a friendly manner. I would be careful with that. Trump doesn't love to tell you. He doesn't do any, tell you clearly what he's going to do. That's what makes him such a, a devil to play with when you're actually playing poker with him, is because you don't know where he's going to go, and he holds his cards very tight to his chest. He's saying that, but when it comes to pass-through tariffs, this administration has been very aggressive with other countries. Pass-through tariffs are about China. They're about Vietnam and Japan and the Philippines, all taking these Chinese products, largely wind and solar panels and crap like that, and dumping them into the U.S. And so I love to hear that the administration is going hard on somebody like Lisa Murkowski, who says, I want these crap wind and solar panels coming from China, made with forced labor, made with cheap coal, heavily subsidized, dumped into our country, and that we take them in. I mean, if we restrict that, we won't be getting any wind and solar. And so that's something like, we heard this in the Energy Security Review Commission, or the National Security Review Commission on China. They hosted a forum on energy. It might have been one of the worst forums I've ever seen our Congress do on China. It was so deplorable. I mean, and they do some decent stuff, right? They did a really good one on Made in China 2025 earlier this year. The one that they did on energy was it was mind-numbing, because all they did was talk about all the wind and solar power that China is making, doing, and how we need to let China subsidize our wind and solar power, and that's a global good that they're providing. And they talk nothing about the competition with China, the fact that they could be making something else than wind turbines and solar panels with this, and that maybe they have other reasons for this and how it's decimating our grid. In fact, the people that they actually had as expert witnesses, they knew China's grid, but they knew nothing about ours. And I don't even think you should be in this space. If you don't have a basic comparison, you can Google this, folks. You shouldn't even be talking about this. So I was very fired up about that, but great point. And I'm excited that Trump is taking that seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. Exciting. There's been just a couple of moves playing poker. He renames the Gulf of Mexico because the Biden administration had banned offshore oil production in the Gulf of Mexico. And that's a simple fix. Rename it Gulf of America. There is no moratorium on drilling in the Gulf of America. Love it. No, 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 no lease lands for coal production. BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, was going to cut leases for coal production, but not for critical minerals. Well, guess what? You rename coal a critical mineral. Boom, done. Problem solved. Lands are being leased again, these federal lands, where the funds actually fund our national parks for the production of that energy that's made here and produced more responsibly than anywhere else on the planet, right here in the United States. Those are just a couple of chess moves, if you will, poker moves that the president played right at the start of the administration. And here we are 6 months into the administration, and just continuing to make progress every single week, if not every single day. We talked a little bit about coal consumption, global coal consumption, and the Reuters is also reporting that China's oil demand is being replaced with their renewables and coal. Is China's oil demand being replaced? What's going on there, Trisha?
Yeah, so in many ways, that's why I say the coal story is really important, right? Is because that is they are trying to offset oil demand with electric vehicles, right? That was the first and foremost impetus on EVs for China, was about reducing their exposure to oil, right? If you import a lot of oil and you don't produce it, and China produces about 4.5 million barrels a day of oil, but they consume on paper, they consume like 17 million barrels a day, which means you're importing a crap ton of crude oil. And so that makes you very vulnerable. And that's why, a lot of people say, hey, China, they're not going to ever go to war. They want, this is why in the 90s and early 2000s, you heard about China's peaceful rise, is because, they need to grow economically and they would never want to disturb the peace because they have to import all this oil and we could just choke that oil off. I think that's not as true as it used to be. I don't believe that, because we have not talked about power generation. And those same people who were studying, oil and maritime movements, they weren't talking about global power generation, or U.S. or Chinese power generation, and what that means and what you do with it. And so if you start transitioning your people and your populace, and you make very cheap EVs and you dump them onto your consumer, so it's the best thing the cheapest thing that they can buy. And by the way, you have deflation in China, right? You have the consumer that is not making very much money. You have all their money tied up in housing, which the prices keep dropping. So of course they want a cheap EV because that's all they can afford. Well, perfect, because that means they plug it into the grid, and the grid is powered by coal. So that reduces their reliance on oil. That doesn't mean they're declining oil. It just means that this is an energy security play for China, and that should make everyone nervous. This is not about China reducing oil consumption because they want to go net zero. That's a load of hogwash. That is not true. This is about energy security, and this should make everyone more concerned that the more secure they feel, the more comfortable they're going to feel in conflict. You don't want energy security because you just want to play around and pet the pretty ducks in the water. You want energy security, and so particularly for China, so you have maneuverability, so you can act should you want to on Taiwan or otherwise. So I think that, when we're looking at oil demand in particular, and there's a couple articles I had sent you, when I talk to industry leaders, doesn't matter who you are, if you don't know China super well, but you're exposed to them, you probably are of the mindset that China is greening, right? That they're adding wind and solar into their grid, that they have a net zero plan, and that's what they're doing. And they're not, right? They have electric vehicles and they have coal-fired power generation. And very simply, if I am going to put electric vehicles into my economy and I don't want to have a revolt, I'm going to have coal-fired power generation because it's reliable, it's dispatchable. I have a ton of it. It's cheap, it's easy, it employs people in the coal sector. So there's a win-win-win, as China likes to call it, the triple wins across the board with coal. And then I just have the cheap EVs and it works. And then I get to dump those EVs onto you, and I get to decimate my Fords and my GMs and my Stellantises and my, Volvos. I get everybody, BMW, you name it, I get to decimate those. So really, yes, they're adding wind and solar into their grid. How that's been, I don't think you would have added as much coal in power generation or added as much into the Chinese grid had you not added the wind and solar, because you have to back it up. And so I don't think that's partly why they're dumping so much of it on us. They realize that this doesn't work well, that it's quite expensive. But if anytime they're using solar or anytime they're using wind, they're not using coal. And for China, that's energy security. It's not about cost. It's not about if their consumer doesn't have power for a minute. It's about energy security. It means that I can stockpile that coal. I have more of a backup. So they're kind of testing and playing around with that. But they're absolutely adding coal-fired power generation, and they're absolutely continuing to use oil, but they would love to stem the growth in that oil consumption. And so what we've seen from them since COVID is the fact that oil consumption has continued to rise, and yet they shut in their economy. That makes no sense. You cannot shut in your economy and shut cities and ports at will for months on end and continue to rise your oil demand. So that 17 million barrels a day oil demand on paper, that's fiction. You know, they're probably around, I would say, around 15 million barrels a day oil demand. You can't have a declining property sector and a mess of an economy and a consumer that's not spending and have rising oil demand. And what they show on paper is rising oil demand. So they're probably stockpiling 1 to 2 million barrels a day of that, which is a lot of stockpiles. That means they are very prepared to insulate themselves should something happen with trade for oil. And so it's really material and meaningful there. And so I think it was Bloomberg that put out an article. The energy aspects had mentioned that, you know, they were stockpiling oil. We know they're stockpiling oil, but the fact that we can actually see it. And there's a really big problem in the oil market when we're trying to understand oil demand. It's really tricky. It's always backward looking. And this cloud and this opaqueness around China makes it really, really messy because they import all this oil and then they stockpile some. So that makes it hard for people to understand how much is the global economy actually consuming when China's stockpiling 1 to 2 million barrels a day out of that sort of 100 million barrel a day production scenario. It gets really clouded and very messy very quickly.
Great intel. It's kind of a group that we ally ourselves with called State Armor. They just published a report about China's influence. It's a group called Energy Foundation China, and they're based in San Francisco with most of their employees Beijing, and how they've been dumping millions of dollars into institutions of higher education here in the United States to study things like decarbonization and promote decarbonization and net zero. They've funded and done the same thing with think tanks around the country, really pushing a political agenda that they don't embrace themselves. And I think that's to try to make us weaker. And just this week, the American Energy Institute published a paper about BlackRock. It's called Behind the Smoke Screen: BlackRock's Hidden Boycott of Oil, Gas, Coal, and Cattle. In 2020 and 2021, I had the opportunity to work on legislation that would become law in Texas. It was Senate Bill 13 that basically said if you're boycotting an industry because of any action that you're taking against that industry, then you don't get to do business with the state of Texas. And BlackRock was put on that boycott list because they were boycotting fossil fuels. And BlackRock's argument was, well, we invest billions of dollars into hydrocarbons and oil and gas in Texas, but they've got clear divestment positions against coal. And that's when I wrote the bill. I made sure it said fossil fuels because that was defined in statute to include oil, gas, and coal. And BlackRock was just recently removed from the boycott list in Texas because they dropped out of some climate cartel groups, the Climate Action 100 Plus and the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which is a Michael Bloomberg founded and funded organization run through the United Nations that's anti-American. So BlackRock's dropped out of these, but they continue to vote against directors of companies that they invest in for not bending the knee to their ESG climate agenda. They continue to support shareholder resolutions at companies, forcing them to align with Paris. And they're actually supporting resolutions at companies like Cracker Barrel and Wingstop and Jack in the Box that will lead to them decreasing their use and consumption of meat. I mean, this is the UN agenda that's very Malthusian. It's anti-American. I tend to look at when these groups drop out of these organizations, are they going to continue down the same path? And clearly BlackRock is. BlackRock should get back on the boycott list in Texas, but they've spent a lot of money on good PR, getting very close to some political leaders here in the state of Texas. But I tend to look at groups when they drop out of these so-called initiatives to say, wow, are they really waking up? Or are they going to continue down the same path? And just reported this week, Shell has dropped out of the science-based targets initiative. Is Shell waking up? Are some of these European majors finally waking up and realizing that the ESG, this decarbonization Paris agenda, it wants to end their business, or are they going to continue down the same path? What are your thoughts there, Trisha?
That was great. The really good rant, Jason. That was awesome. So, I mean, you can see I'm sitting here in my new makeshift studio. I'm in Newcastle, Wyoming, and it just makes me, when I think of when people talk about oil and cattle and all these things that they're anti, and people realize these are tied together, right? The oil and gas community is not like, these are typically rural communities, and people know where things are made and where they come from, and they support it. This house is sitting across the street from the Wyoming Refining Company refinery, which refines 20,000 barrels of oil a day. I don't hear people walking around complaining about this. Frankly, I don't. I think it's awesome because and I tell my nieces, every time we walk by this, everyone in my family, how much crude comes out of this refinery and how this is powering this state and this nation. I mean, this is what America runs on. And so I think it's just amazing when we talk about cattle. I heard this in college, right? When I was at Regis University, it drove me nuts when, I mean, I am hypoglycemic. I love meat, and I live on it, and protein is so good for you. We're seeing people trade down right now in meat because they can't afford it, right? Because beef prices are so damn high, it's ridiculous. And so people are trading down. Well, so Cracker Barrel and all these guys, they have an incentive, to BS people on the climate front. That's why they're doing it on the beef side. It's because it's expensive, right? They want to sell more chicken and things like that are cheaper to their consumer. So they get to placate everyone on that. So we have to be honest about why companies actually do things. I listened to Tractor Supply a little bit ago just on CNBC, and they were talking about how the rural consumer is actually they're positive about the economy. And I think that has a lot to do with Trump, right? The rural household, the rural people that live in actual America, we do feel bullish because we have Trump in office. Well, at least we no longer, our lifestyle, our way of life of cattle and oil is being fought on every front, which is what we saw in the previous administration. And so I think that these are really good signs when I see companies pulling out of this. And this is something, Jason, and I've talked to you about before, is that I have been telling people this in the podcast. I've been telling clients this, when 2020 hit and everyone lost their minds during COVID and we lost oil demand, and then everyone went nuts. Particularly look back at old CNN clips of oh, this is what the world can be like. I mean, basically people, the far left and the progressives and everyone on climate used COVID as an opportunity to say this is it, right? We're never going to go back. And that's actually when you saw all those peak demand things where people said, oh, we peaked oil demand in 2019. Where on earth did they get, that's ridiculous. They were lying. They just said, okay, now we can lower oil demand, so we peaked in 2019. Every one of those has been debunked because we're actually increasing our oil demand, not declining. And so these agendas, and I want to say, and ConocoPhillips, they've rolled back from this, but I have to be honest because I'm an analyst. That's what I do. ConocoPhillips was the first U.S. independent to start on the net zero bandwagon, right? And they started putting net zero in their reports. Notice that they don't put that in the report anymore. No one's talking about net zero. And so I told clients and I told everyone, hey, this will fade. This is the trend of the time. You feel this with investor pressure, but investor pressure shifts. And when your president shifts and your president pulls out of the Paris Climate Accords, that is a sign and signal to the market that you're going to be able to invest in oil and gas in the largest country in the world that produces oil and gas, 13.5 million barrels a day. Why wouldn't you want to be able to invest in it? So it's a really good signal. And when Exxon was saying, no, we should stay in the Paris Climate Accords, absolutely not. No, you produce more oil and gas in the world. If you pull out of the Paris Climate Accords, it gives a signal to the market that you can actually invest in these companies. And so when Shell is pulling out of this initiative, that is so huge, folks. I think you can underscore enough. It means that Shell, they have pivoted a little bit. In the past 2 years, they've walked back a lot of their climate stuff. They walked back, basically, we don't need to, essentially slowing the fact that we need to increase output. And now what happened was this initiative, there's a really good Financial Times article that I encourage you guys to take a look at, because it's not just Shell, it's the other BP company, Anchor BP, I think Aker BP, and there's another company. They all pulled out of it. And they all pulled out of they all pulled out of it. And the reason was because the initiative basically said you have to stop increasing oil output. And essentially these companies, it limited their ability to actually just invest and drill and produce oil. And so you hear this in Europe when you're talking to European companies. If you're in Europe or you're abroad, you'll hear that they can't actively invest because they're restricted by their shareholders and their bank pressure and everything. So the reality is that these companies realize that they can't do business. And you make money by putting the drill bit into the ground and producing these assets. These are oil and gas companies. I'm in wind. I don't want them in solar. I want them doing what they need to do because, one, we consume over 100 million barrels a day of oil per day. I need them to produce it so we can consume it. And I don't want them wind and solar and electricity focused because that's not what they do. So the fact that Shell has done this and they pulled out and this is finally becoming public, this is a signal to the world and to the market. This is not sustainable. This never was. And it's losing steam. And so when you start taking the steam out of this, you start taking all the crazy, the hype around it, and you start taking the investability away from it. And what's really interesting is that initiative, that group, had put so much weight and work behind oil and gas, and now they're pulling back on it because they're not getting them, people are not interested in it. So reality just it comes around. I wish the oil and gas industry was better and we were leading. We'd never had to lean into this. We never had to. And I'm okay calling out people like, I want Exxon, I want Occidental, I want these big companies to lead and say, I produce oil and gas and I'm proud of it. Their employees are proud of it, they should be too. And so this is a good start. It needs to keep going, and that we need to rev up the pressure on this for oil companies. These are publicly traded. The pressure exists. If you can pressure to put them in the sustainability stuff, you can pressure them to pull out.
Yeah, I love living a high carbon lifestyle. I wish the rest of the world could too. I wish that Exxon and Oxy and companies like that would talk about the benefits of what it means to live a high carbon lifestyle, because it means clean air. You're right next to a refinery in Wyoming. Wyoming gets a majority of their electric generation from coal. It's some of the cleanest air in the world, one of the most pristine, beautiful places on the planet. And that's not the narrative that you hear in the media. And so I think that they need to tout those benefits of what it means to live a high carbon lifestyle. It means that as a woman, you don't have to walk to collect water like they do around the world, which I think is absolutely appalling. And I think it's shout out to Shell and the BP company and Enbridge for dropping out, because the draft.
Yeah, BP and Enbridge. That was the other one. Enbridge is the big one.
Yeah, just the draft standards that were put out by the Science Based Targets Initiative. I see science-based, and that's like that rings a cult to me.
Yep.
Just that term right there. The Cult Targets Initiative stated that the company should not develop new oil and gas fields once they submitted a climate plan, or from end of 2027.
Yes.
That's coming up pretty quick, whichever was earlier, which is just mind-boggling to me. It's like, okay, you're going to.
How could you tell the public? Like, how can you even think that you would? I mean, and obviously these people make money, right? Because they invest in this. Like, people have to realize there's so much money being made on all this green BS. So they're making money on this, but how could they even imagine that? They're like, hey, okay, oil company, you big company, Shell or BP, or Enbridge, you cannot actually invest in what you're doing. So once you send us the document, then you have to stop. Like, that's ridiculous. Like, I feel like this is like a child's club or something, like a second grade best friends club. You can't look at Bobby Joe or whatever for 2 minutes. Like, this is absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, it really is, especially what's happening in Guyana and the opportunities in Argentina with oil and gas exploration, in Poland, as I mentioned earlier. There's just some really great plays that are happening out there. It is nice. It is refreshing. I will give Chevron some credit. Their CEO, Mike Wirth, has had some really good messaging lately, talking about the need for natural gas for electric generation. They just completed their merger with Hess, which opens up huge opportunities for Central and South America with oil production. But I just appreciate his messaging. He's not talking anything about climate and decarbonization. Nope. He's talking about producing more hydrocarbons for the benefit of man.
I give him credit, and I give credit where credit is due. And I just haven't seen this from Darren Woods yet, and I would love to see it. Is to a little bit of a pivot. He was doing a little bit of a more technical pivot when they purchased Pioneer Natural Resources. But when like Mike Wirth, he was pretty on message during COVID saying, we are going to be producing this oil. He pivoted a little and said, okay, we're going to have the lowest carbon barrel. And essentially he's come back and just said, no, we need this oil and gas. We're going to produce it. And in fact, I do like Chevron, and I'm not advising people on stock purchases, but I like Chevron a lot because they're basically, they've reined it in, right? They have reined in their global investment. They are not exposed. I don't believe they have any assets in China. Exxon does, ConocoPhillips does. Like, this is like having assets in Russia, like, get out, right? You need to be getting out now. That's a no-brainer. You're not making money on this stuff. I guarantee you're not. You're probably not even breaking even. But Chevron has reined this in. And so they are saying, this is where we're going to do this. And so they're becoming a much more North American focused company. The Hess merger and acquisition it's fantastic. I mean, I love the Bakken. I'm a huge fan. I mean, actually, you can't see this over here. There's a rig over here in this picture over here, but I mean, the Bakken is just in a phenomenal oil play. It's the first unconventional oil play, and so now that they have Hess, I mean, I think we're going to see, everybody says these plays are left for dead, and we have peak shale. I think you're going to see that heartily debunked. There's so much oil left in the Bakken, and so if you think about these wells that were producing, 4,000-foot laterals in 2010 or 2008, and they were producing 3,000 barrels a day, okay, first, your lateral length is short, and two, what about if you refract those wells? And I think, obviously, it's just going to be great. I don't love when we see consolidation and the fact that it usually reduces the rig count, it reduces activity in a lot of places. But in terms of the life of the asset, in terms of the longevity and the investment and the less volatility to cycles, it is a good thing. And so I think it's a great thing that, Hess is a big oil company anyway, so there's not much noise there from Chevron to Hess. But I think look at the Bakken, look at the places where they really gain the steam, and Guyana is huge. And actually now Chevron with the Hess merger is bigger than Exxon, so they have overtaken. So it's a really big deal. And I think, that's the other thing too, is that it makes me just think about when everyone's kind of counting oil down and out, and I think about why we're at $65 oil. It's Thursday, July 24th, 2025. We're at $65 oil, about $66 oil, just under. And you think about that, well, why is that? Well, it's because we have so much oil on the market. Yes, there's a lot of geopolitics. There's a lot of things going on. There's economic concerns. We're kind of hanging in there for the economy. But we have a lot of oil supply. And $65 oil, I can tell you, if you stay there for a long time, the market will adapt to it. And I just think about Guyana, and I think look at Brazil, and I look at all these, the incremental output. Look at Canada. Like, we're just very, very good at producing oil. So, I mean, I say that I'm not like we're going to 85 and we're staying there forever, but in terms of like the market and the economy and like, is this investable? 100% absolutely put your money behind oil and gas all day long.
So what sort of optimism do we have here in the United States? Where are we at production here in the United States? You mentioned cost earlier. As you know, we're a trade organization that represents oil, gas, coal, and nuclear companies in various stages of exploration and production and transportation, and then some that are just in ancillary products that they offer to the market. But what economic outlook do you foresee for American energy companies over the coming months?
Yeah, so I mean, it's the $1 million question, right? Is that the questions I get from clients and I get from the industry and podcast listeners and folks is that really, okay, one, what's the trajectory for oil prices? And are we too low or are we too high right now? And two, what does that mean for the oil and gas, the U.S. oil and gas industry? And that's why I think it's so important to put it in context of that 13.5 million barrels per day. You know, part of the softness in oil prices is we're just producing a lot of crude oil. We're also producing over 130 billion cubic feet per day of natural gas, which means we're more than double Russia, which is the second largest producer of natural gas. So we're producing so much natural gas. So absolutely, we need to get more natural gas into electricity. And we are, but it's not as substantial, right? We need to be pulling it in left, right, and center, and we need to be passing along those costs to the consumer. That would be really material in helping hold up the industry as well. Something really important to point out is that this year we've seen, and not right now, we're about $3 an MCF for natural gas for Henry Hub, but last year we were at $2 the whole year. Average $2 an MCF. That's extremely low, and that was hard on the industry. But we had slightly higher oil prices, and those kind of offset each other. Well, 350 gas, which is what we had just a few weeks ago, 350 gas is not bad, especially in comparison to 2. And so you've actually seen an uptick in the natural gas rig count, and that's what drove if you're looking at the overall rig count, no one was paying attention to it, but now since we've had a decline in prices, everybody's watching it every week. And so we're like 44 rigs, okay? And so yes, in the coming months, we're gonna have to really watch production for May and June and July to see what that production is and how the rig count and the frac fleets have materially impacted it. But we're right now seeing natural gas rig count tick up a little bit, and that's because we're seeing some optimism on there. I sat down with Ron Gusick, the CEO of Liberty, and we were talking about this, of the state of the industry and the frac market. They're exposed to natural gas. I mean, you're seeing some hardy, I would say it's not necessarily discipline, it's that people are okay drilling and completing for natural gas right now in those prices. When it comes to oil, $65 oil is not amazing, but it's not 55, right? So we came off these highs that we saw at 75. We didn't have any geopolitical risk premium. I still don't think it's $65 oil. We have massive geopolitical risk premium priced into oil. But if you say it's 65, the industry is kind of going to adapt to it. And yes, we're dropping frac fleets and rig counts, but I talked to a lot of companies, and they're talking to rig companies. They're getting lower day rates. They're talking to frac guys who are saying or looking for market share, and they're getting price competitive. And I think we have to really appreciate, and was so great because I went through, before sitting down with Ron, I went through like several of Liberty's earnings calls, and there's a wealth of knowledge in there, folks, on just the market. And one of them is that, a few quarters ago, Chris Wright was telling everyone when he was the CEO is that, hey, we are able to basically hold production flat with the rig count and the frac fleet that we have. Well, they actually did more than hold production flat in the U.S. We actually grew production. And so what it's telling you is that the frac industry, the service sector, is really good at their job, right? The drillers are drilling very, very quickly, and they're very, very efficient. And so we can drill more, and we can drill longer laterals, and we can reduce that cost. And so every incremental little bit there, and I know there's not a ton left to get, but every incremental bit adds up, and it really works well in the face of a low oil price environment. So what we're seeing is that 13.5 million barrels a day oil production kind of grinding higher. Last couple months of April and May, March and April have been flat a little bit. It's a lot easier to maintain that output. And that's what I caution folks is, if you were think back to May when we had the Diamondback earnings call and the Diamondback letter that said we're dropping rigs and we're dropping frac fleets, and we expect everyone else to do the same. Yeah, people have dropped rigs. Are they going to continue to drop rigs? That's a big question at $65 oil. I don't think you should. But that doesn't mean the entire market has to do that. And people on the back of that call and those comments were saying, Paul Sankey and others were saying, we should drop 1 million barrels a day of production or 2 million barrels a day in the US. Hello. One, we shouldn't do that. That doesn't make any sense because it would be importing that oil. But two, to drop 2 million barrels a day output, you would have to tank the rig count and tank frac fleets, and you would have to tank activity. We're not doing that. You would have to see completions every month drop to less than half they are now, which we didn't even go that low during COVID. During the depths of the worst part of COVID, we never even went that low. So newsflash to everyone, we're not going to lose 2 million barrels a day or even 1 million barrels of output. It would take a lot of work. You would have to take activity in half, and you would have to run the activity level for 5 years to see us really materially drop output. You can hold output pretty high for a while. You could drop output to 13 million barrels a day and hold it there pretty easily. So if you're banking on the U.S. dropping output to solve oil prices, it's not going to happen. I think it's just far more resilient and more sticky than people realize.
Trisha, I love the fact that you talk about efficiency in production. These longer wells, the longer lateral lengths in our wells, more efficient, producing more oil with fewer rigs. It's interesting because recovering politician here, when I was in the legislature in Texas, we'd have people come and talk to us about all the jobs that wind and solar were going to create and these variable sources of electric generation. And now I'm seeing the same thing on the carbon capture side. It's like, oh, if we have carbon capture, it could create 7,500 new jobs at average of $45 an hour. And I'm thinking, and it's just really easy messaging, create jobs. Politicians love jobs, 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 but they're efficient jobs. And it takes 8.7 more jobs per equivalent amount of electricity to produce for wind and solar than it does for natural gas and coal and nuclear.
Yep.
And so I like to make a comparison analogy. You go out to grab a quick lunch somewhere like Chipotle or Cava, and you've got one, maybe two people that are assembling your food. Well, imagine 18 people assembling your food. It wouldn't be very efficient. It would cost you a whole lot more. And then the government's giving the Chipotle or Cava some subsidies on the back end to create all these jobs, but your food costs more, your tax burden is higher. And it's just not necessary. It's incredibly.
And then for electricity, Jason, the equivalent to say that's saying that, okay, I'm subsidizing you and I'm giving you a bad product in return. So the real problem you have with that is that, you're subsidizing it and then it goes into your grid and then it increases the cost for consumers so that your Chipotles and Cavas have a harder time doing business. So it's a backwards way of doing business. And that's what I think we have to emphasize to everyone is that I'm sorry, I don't give a crap about the jobs. You built that solar panel in China. You did it with forced labor. You didn't pay anyone for it. You did it with coal-fired power generation. There are no human rights. There are no environmental standards behind that. Then you're going to force it into my grid and say I gave a few jobs? That's crap. That's absolute horse crap. That is ridiculous. It's not. It's creating a handful of jobs. And there's the end market, like carbon sequestration. I was telling this to a client the other day, and he said, you reminded me, you have to have a market, okay? You know where we use carbon? We use it in pop, okay? It's think about, if you're going to produce oil from it, great. The way for carbon to work, we cannot pay people to sequester something into the ground that does nothing. That's not value added. If you want to give Occidental a tax credit to produce more oil with that CO2, go for it. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with giving, and not a subsidy, but saying they can get a deduction because they're going to produce more oil that's going to benefit the economy. Awesome. Do it. But don't give anyone a tax credit for taking CO2 and pumping into the ground. You're enabling, as you say, you're feeding the crocodiles, okay? You have to stop this. So I think that's really important. And these longer laterals, Jason, I think the efficiency is so awesome because I just looked at it, and I know you wanted me to mention it, is that it's on the average right now for the U.S., we're at over 11,500 feet. I think people know, this rig that you can see here, this one in North Dakota, that was doing this, that was probably in 2010, right? That rig was probably drilling, they were doing 10,000-foot laterals there. But across the board in the Midland and Permian, they weren't, right? They were doing 1, 2 miles. Now we're seeing on average, we're well over 2 miles in the U.S. And we're seeing the real gains. That rig over here, this is probably from the 70s. That's a vertical rig that was fracking one little zone and one frac. Now we're drilling 2 miles out consistently. But now in the Permian, we're over 13,000 foot. So at the Permian, on average, we're well over 2 miles a lateral. We're pushing on, we're getting close to this 3 mile mark. And you think about that. Think about where you're sitting right now and think about 3 miles, 10,000 feet deep and 3 miles out. That is what's happening. And the fact that we get better about that every day, that we're fracking the edge of that rock, that toe or that end of that lateral, and we're getting the production we are, it's so important because it means we're not seeing diminishing marginal returns. We're not seeing actually a material drop in production. And I can guarantee you that we're going to be better at completing that toe 5 years from now than we are now. And so it's just those efficiencies are going to get better. And, you know, there's an impact to jobs in terms of you're drilling longer laterals, which means you have less wells on top of the ground, and it's more efficient. And that means that you can frack more. There's a speed. And so it does mean also when you're looking at that frack fleet count and you're looking at that rig count, be very careful that you think that there's going to be a corresponding drop in production, because there hasn't. There might be in these recent drops, but there hasn't been, you know, from a few months ago, because we don't need as many frac fleets because the horsepower is higher, and we don't need as many rigs because we're drilling with what, you know, we're drilling a 13,000 or 4 miler, or even in some cases more than 4 mile long laterals. Like, that's Bananaville, and that's what we're doing as an industry. That's the stuff that, and that's why I love being your economist, because that's the stuff that you're promoting and talking about. This is that this is American energy, and we should be damn proud of that.
Yeah, absolutely. We support free markets. We represent companies that align with us, that reject political agendas like ESG and DEI and decarbonization and Paris. More paleoclimatologists are coming out with more and more information that shows that man contributions to greenhouse gas emissions aren't having any impact on global temperatures. If we're living through a catastrophic climate crisis, I want more of it, because people are doing incredibly well, and life expectancies have increased with access to affordable and reliable energy. And so if there are politicians or policymakers or staff that are listening to this, because we will distribute this out to policymakers around the country, I want to encourage you to reject the jobs notion that's coming from some of these variable sources of electric generation, or coming to you from carbon capture, because they're not efficient jobs. They don't do anything to mitigate a changing climate. They just make energy more expensive. And that's something that's happening around this country up until the current administration, is the cost of energy was increasing and people were losing their primary utilities at their home. 30% increase in people just from 2021 to 2022 lost access to electricity. I mean, they got disconnected. 76% increase in people that lost access to natural gas at home. It means it got disconnected. That was over 5 million Americans over that span of 1 year. Those are the people that are at greatest risk of homelessness, because they don't have access to affordable and reliable energy. And I say they're at the greatest risk of homelessness because, you know, your homeowner's insurance policies and any lease that you sign require that you have your utilities connected. And when they get disconnected, you violate the terms of those agreements. So just to leave you with a couple of messaging points: expensive energy hurts the poor, and we're world leaders in environmental protection in this country. We've reduced pollution nearly 80% over the last 5 decades. We're number one when it comes to access to clean and safe drinking water, and there are 7 billion people on the planet that don't get to experience either of those, and they can with affordable, reliable energy, preferably from the United States, because we produce it more responsibly than anywhere else on the planet. And so thanks so much for joining Trisha and I on this edition. Look forward to catching up with you soon. If you have any questions, or if you want to inspire a podcast, ask some great questions in the comments and we'll get back to you. Trisha, where can people find you?
They can find me on LinkedIn at Trisha Curtis. They can find me on LinkedIn. PetroNerds has a LinkedIn page. I put out a lot of short videos and posts and everything. You can find the podcast on the PetroNerds website, and you can find it on anywhere Spotify, iTunes, anywhere, YouTube, watch it. And then on Twitter as well at Trisha J. Coffee and PetroNerds. So, Jason, it's been awesome. Thank you. And I will be in DC the first week of September. So hopefully Jason and I, or the two of us or one of us, will be out there and happy to talk to folks on the Hill and educate them with a lot of this data and charts and all these things on energy. And can't echo that enough, Jason, of, you know, if you are for wind and solar in the grid, then you are not for affordable or reliable energy, and you are not for the lower income consumer.
Amen to that. Well, keep living a high carbon lifestyle. Until next time, we'll see you soon. Thanks.
Okay, bye.